It's the middle of June, June 14th today, and in this video we're going to show you how we maximize our space and our season by multi-cropping and interplanting. We can really get the most out of our growing season, extending it by starting some of our warm season crops early while our cool season crops are still in harvest. Now in mid-June it's the transition time. So in Utah's climate we have a cool spring, but then when summer hits, it hits at the beginning to middle of June, and it suddenly changes to hot and dry and sunny every day. Like I said, today's June 14th. It was 93 degrees today, not a cloud in sight, no chance of precipitation even in the extended forecast. So we really need to transition these cool weather crops to warm weather crops. So here we have peas, and we really got a nice harvest out of these peas because we got them in early during the cool season. And we've been harvesting these now for about 3 weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks. And we're still going to harvest some more, but at this point, when they're in a full swing like this, they're really using a lot of water. So one thing I like to do is start some warm season crops early. And today we're going to plant some squash, and we're going to plant this squash right here and use the same space where the peas are. But because I started these as transplants, we get a jump on the season. So these I started from seed 2.5, 3 weeks ago, and then we're going to plant them in here, but they've already got a head start. And then we might harvest these peas for about another week or two. But as the squash starts needing more water and more sun and more space, the peas will be finishing, so we can pull the peas out and use this water that we have in this area and this space to grow the squash up this trellis. So that's the idea. So we're going to go ahead and plant this squash now. And squash is one of those things that it's really good to plant from seed. And we could plant this squash from seed, that would be no problem. But in this case, because I'm using this space also for peas, I like to go ahead and start it early and plant it as a transplant. And so I'm going to dig a fairly big hole. We can plant these a little bit deeper than the soil line here, to give it a little bit extra support. And the nice thing about using these cups is you want to support the plant like this, turn the cup over, and then I got the plant right there. And as you can see, we got some roots here. And some people wouldn't do this, but I really like to kind of tease the roots out. Now you want to be careful not to break any roots, but as you can see, I'm not sure if you can see too well, but the roots are starting to grow a little bit in a circle. This isn't root bound by any means, but they are growing around in the bottom of what was that cup, right? So I just like to tease them out just a little bit with my fingers, being careful not to break any, but to try to make sure, see how I did that? That when I transplant this, these roots are going to start spreading right away. And this transplant can be very, very hard on a plant, especially on a 90-degree sunny day. So right now it's 7:20. So I like to do these transplants in the evening because that's going to give this squash plant plenty of time to recover from transplant shock before the heat hits tomorrow. So we're going to stick this in the hole here, and we're going to just fill the dirt in. And I dug the hole so that it's a little bit deeper than my transplant, and then that way, when I get it in there, I can support the stem a little bit. And you can see this squash plant, depending on how well you can see with the light, is pretty close to where these peas are. So what we're going to do is let this squash recover. Got to do a little weeding while we're here. We're going to let this squash plant recover from transplant. Just start growing, and it's going to grow fast. Squash grow really fast. And then by the time it's ready to start really growing, these peas will be done and we'll pull them out. And by doing this, we have peas and squash growing. We're giving ourselves an extra 2 to 3 weeks in our growing season. So once you got that in and you got the stem well supported, got your squash plant planted nice and deep, you got to make sure you give it a good watering. So we're going to go ahead and water it really thoroughly during transplant. Then make sure that you're taking out all the air gaps that are in there, and you get it off to a good start. So I got another squash plant that I'm going to plant on the other side here. This is a 4-foot wide bed, and we have a 7-foot trellis that we're going to trellis this squash up. This is a winter squash. It's a baby honey nut butternut squash. Makes a nice little butternut squash, individual size. They're great for storing. So it's a winter squash. So we're planting it now in June. And we'll be harvesting that throughout the fall. So that's the plan. I'll show you a couple other ways that we're multi-planting or interplanting here in a minute. So it's 6 days later now after we transplanted our squash starts, and we're getting some good growth on our squash, and we were able to get one more big harvest of our peas, and then looks like a couple more are on there about ready to harvest now. We'll get a couple more, let's see, but really almost all the peas are done, plus the plants have been suffering a little bit in the heat. You can see over here they just don't like the hot weather, and now that it's mid, almost late June, it's time to get the peas out. And then the squash is really looking good now, but it will really benefit from more sun and more water once we get those peas out of there. This one's looking really good. Okay, so we got the peas pulled out now. It's been 1 week, 7 days since we transplanted this squash in here, and they seem to be off to a really good start. So here's 2 here, and the other 2 here, and starting them early with that 2.5 weeks of full sun before we put them in here really got them off to a good start. You can see this one's really starting to grow. Depending on how much sun they get, the growth is a little uneven, but they're looking really good. And then the other bed that we're multi-cropping is this one. And in the cool weather, in the early spring, here we grew broccoli, mostly broccoli with 1 cauliflower, and then beetroot. And the timeline on that was that the beets and the broccoli cauliflower, we started from seed mid-February, grew them in our small greenhouse until the end of March when we transplanted them here. And those are really fast maturing crops. So they started producing a harvest in mid-May, and we harvested those until the end of May. And when we went ahead and sowed these bush beans in between the area, like interplanted them in between the area where the broccoli and the cauliflower and the beets were. And then I went ahead and snuck a few dwarf sunflowers in between our bush beans, so we'll see how that works. But the bush beans were sown probably May 30th, again, the very end of May. And then we allowed a week of overlap where we let the broccoli flower, and I have a clip from that I'll show you now. So we have broccoli here, and we went ahead and planted seed in between the broccoli, and even though we're not harvesting the broccoli anymore, we are leaving it there because it's protecting the soil. It shades some of the soil and makes it easier to germinate the seed, while at the same time still attracting with these flowers, it's really attracting beneficial insects. So you can see there's a honeybee there, there was a bumblebee, there's a lot of predatory wasps. But now with this bed, these beans have already been in for 3.5, 4 weeks. They're off to a good start. And then we also have some squash here that we did a similar thing with when we pulled the peas out. So these squash, these beans, sunflowers, the squash over there we've made the full transition now to warm season crops. It's warm, it's June, it's 90 degrees, but they should be off and running. And something about these bush beans is they mature really fast. So if we're lucky, they'll mature and we'll try to sneak in a fall cool weather crop after them if we can. Maybe the spinach, something that grows really fast, we could maybe sneak in August if these mature in time. Okay, hopefully with this video you've gotten some ideas, some tips on how you can grow more food in smaller spaces. By multi-cropping these areas, we're really getting a lot more production. Typically when we think about gardening in Utah, a lot of times we think about well, I'll plant my garden around Mother's Day, like mid-May. But really in this area, by using cool season crops that mature quickly, we can get 2 harvests out of this. With the exception of the squash, which will be here until throughout the fall. These are all quick maturing crops. So that's a tip. You can use quick maturing crops, mix them in, use the same area to crop multiple things. And then the other tip is notice that there's a little bit of crop rotation happening also. We're using legumes half the time. So the peas are a nitrogen fixing legume that we use before the squash. And then here, the brassicas with the broccoli and the cauliflower are heavy feeders. So we're following that with beans, which is a legume, and also will do some nitrogen fixing for us. So that wraps it up. Thanks for watching Foodscaping Utah, and grow your own.